So South Africa continues to grapple with illicit tobacco trade, which costs this country literally billions of rand. According to recent reports, almost 70% of all cigarettes consumed come from the black market. This makes this country one of the biggest unlawful tobacco markets in the world, we're told. Previously, experts had warned that the ban on nicotine products during the hard lockdown to prevent the spread of COVID-19 will see the illicit market flourish. So let's discuss this further with Sinenhlanhla Mnguni, who's the chairperson of the Fair Trade Independent Tobacco Association, with us in our studio this morning. Sinenhlanhla, great to see you as always.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
For making the trip. So those figures were actually published apparently after research was done by British Tobacco America, and I wonder whether or not that resonates with you. 70% of the market being the black market in this country, does that sound right?
That sounds a bit excessive in my view, and of course we have to think about where that study comes from. I mean, it's commissioned by an industry player, and I mean, if you look at the latter end of that publication where they released the study, they go on to deal with issues wherein they want the government to focus at, where, for instance, they say that government has placed an inordinate amount of time and resources policing issues which affect them, and they should be looking elsewhere. So, I mean, you of course have to apply your mind and see that study for what it is, you know. Of course, we do not dispute that there is a problem with the illicit trade in the country. I think even independent research institutes have pointed towards that. For instance, the University of Cape Town, through their REAP division, which deals with excisable products. And of course, we had cautioned government prior to the implementing of the ban on the sale of cigarettes during the initial stages of the lockdown period against implementing this ban for the same reason, that it would lead to a rise in the illicit trade in cigarettes.
Sure. So you don't necessarily agree fully with the study, but there is consensus around the lockdown having an adverse effects on the market. Help us understand where the market is today then, as far as you're concerned, because my understanding is that we are still to get back to those pre-COVID-19 levels.
Definitely, and I mean, of course, as I'd stated previously, the illicit trade in cigarettes has been an issue even prior to the lockdown ban. The Nugent report, which looked into the affairs of the South African Revenue Service, for instance, highlighted this, and there were previous reports by, for instance, the UCT REAP division. What has happened post the lifting of the cigarette ban is that, of course, these criminal enterprises which have plied their trade in the illicit trade have increased their networks. I think because they pretty much were the only ones who were able to trade during the lockdown period, they were able to then establish new markets. And of course, that would pose challenges for the legitimate industry, which, for instance, the members of my organization form a part of. And we are still battling to gain back the market share which we lost to those illegal networks.
How bad has that blow been?
It's been quite severe, and I think it's borne out by the revenue drop in as far as what the South African Revenue Service has collected from the industry, and it is in the tune of billions. Obviously not as excessive as what is stated in the report by British American Tobacco, but we are hopeful that government will step up and assist industry in rooting out this scourge, which of course is not only robbing the manufacturers and indirectly the employees that are employed by these manufacturers, but the fiscus and the greater South African population.
Yeah. You know, often around this time we'd also speak about who the biggest losers potentially are. I mean, there's questions around the impact this is having, a disproportionate impact on the big players and the smaller players like the ones you represent. But there's also concerns, which you've alluded to, around the money that is being lost to SARS. I mean, in my mind, and I'm not in the industry in any way, even as a consumer, but I'm also worried potentially about the health ramifications of something like this in a context where I imagine the kind of products being sold in the illicit market don't go through the necessary health checks always.
Look, that's a very complex issue to raise, because sometimes you find that illicit cigarettes are manufactured by those that you would assume are the biggest cigarette companies in the world. So, I mean, any manufacturer is capable of manufacturing an illicit cigarette. So sometimes, of course, there is merit to that argument that perhaps sometimes the necessary health checks are not met, but sometimes I mean, even the biggest players worldwide have been found wanting in as far as the illicit trade. I mean, you can think of the biggest tobacco company in the world, and at some stage they've been sanctioned for being complicit in the illicit trade.
So you reckon that's the case even in South Africa?
Look, I think there have been findings to that effect, even in this country in the past. I know that one manufacturer in particular had been scheduled for an amount in the region of 2 billion rand for its role in the illicit trade. So, of course, this is a global phenomenon. It's not unique to South Africa.
How then do we fix it? I mean, it really is unique and complex, because you would imagine the illicit market to not have legitimate players, for lack of a better term, fueling it and giving it life, because at the very least those individuals will be working towards crushing out the market so that they're ultimately able to benefit in legitimate ways. But that's not the case in this industry.
No, definitely. And I think the best way to go about dealing with something like that is to ensure that from a capacity point of view, the revenue service and all other departments which are tasked with dealing and policing the industry are strengthened rather, to ensure that you avoid compliance risks, and ultimately you ensure that there's a high level of compliance in the industry. We saw previously in roughly around 2014, SARS had initiated a project called Honey Badger, which I think was on the verge of dealing with a lot of these compliance risks. It seems of late that again SARS is on the right track. We've seen a number of non-compliant cigarette manufacturers being taken to task and being dealt with by the Revenue Service. So, and of course, there's also been measures being put into place, such as production counters on cigarette manufacturing machines, the placing of officials in all cigarette manufacturing warehouses, and so forth. And I think those measures are geared at obviously ensuring that there is a high level of compliance. And I think at this stage, like I said, we are pretty much on the right track to ensuring that compliance, at least from the legitimate manufacturers, is in place. What then needs to happen, and another big problem that we face, is that the borders are unacceptably porous, and we are not seeing as much emphasis being placed on enforcement at the borders as we are seeing on the legitimate cigarette manufacturers. And I think a lot more needs to be done in as far as policing our borders and ensuring that the right capacity is placed there to ensure that whatever comes through there, if it is non-compliant, is detected and dealt with.
Yeah, briefly if you can, Sinenhlanhla. I mean, the fear is always that once the illicit market grows, it becomes hard, if not impossible, to shrink it back again. How confident are you that we'll be able to get it to, at the very least, those pre-COVID-19 levels?
Look, I mean, it's been done elsewhere in the world, and I think that if government independently, without influence from any players in the industry, deals with the industry holistically through the value chain, I do not see how there can be difficulty. And like I said, there are signs that are showing that government is on the right track. I mean, when I say government, I mean the South African Revenue Service is on the right track. And I think if they tap into the resources of other departments which can perhaps assist, for instance, in monitoring of the border, such as the Department of Home Affairs and Defense and so forth, I think we could be on the track back to where we were pre-COVID, and even at a better stage than what we were there, because, I mean, there were still issues even back then.
All right, Sinenhlanhla Mnguni, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. You did warn that we'd get here. Unfortunate that your warning appears to have materialized, but hopefully we'll be able to fix it moving forward. Sinenhlanhla Mnguni is the chairperson at the Fair Trade Independent Tobacco Association. That's FITA.